Welcome, everyone, to a Tuesday morning episode of the Call Sheet Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Smith, here on the Fans First Sports Network. Very interesting topic this morning. It is July 29th. Tomorrow is the 80th anniversary of a fascinating event in American history, an event that should probably be remembered by more individuals, but unfortunately has sort of been lost to the pages of history. We're commemorating that event today because tomorrow is my Whiteboard Wednesday show, and I'll have as my guest Coach Dennis Scuderi, who's been running the spread offense for about 20 years. And we're going to talk about, well, what does that really mean? I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the spread. What is the spread? And we're going to get into that with Dennis tomorrow. So today we're commemorating the 80th anniversary of the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, an American ship that went down in the Pacific on July 30th, 1945. And we're going to relate the courage of the individuals who survived that sinking, spending 5 days floating in the Pacific Ocean before they were rescued, and the harrowing ordeal that they underwent. And we're going to look at the idea of courage and compare it to the courage that you often see on athletic fields. Because I would argue that they're two very, very different things. They are both real. The courage that you can show as an athlete is real, but it pales in comparison to the courage that is exemplified in warfare. And it's important that we draw those distinctions, that we don't confuse those two. And that's something, again, that I think in our enthusiasm for sports in America and in our desire to create drama on athletic fields or find these incredible human stories within our athletes, that we can sometimes conflate what real courage is or what real bravery and heroism is versus those things we see from athletes. And I'm not trying to diminish in any way, shape, or form the courage of some of our athletes. But again, let's tell the story of the Indianapolis so that we can get a better understanding of what some people in the military or in these particular types of situations have actually gone through. So if you've ever seen the movie Jaws, then you have an idea that the story of the Indianapolis may sound familiar to you. And it's interesting that Jaws has become our go-to reference point, our cultural reference point for remembering the story of the Indianapolis. We're not really a society that places a great value on history. It's just not emphasized here in America the way that it is in other places. We're still a relatively young country. Our history is a lot shorter, more brief than that of other countries. When I was in Italy a couple years ago, I just was blown away walking through Rome and trying to wrap my brain around how long some of those places had been there. The appreciation for that, the respect for that is much deeper, I think, than here in America, where we're a very forward-thinking culture. So we're not great students of history. And again, it's a cultural movie. It's Jaws that brings us our remembrances of the Indianapolis. If you can remember the scene from the movie, Captain Quint, the old fisherman, hired to kill the shark, Chief Brody, the police chief in town, and the young scientist Matt Hooper, all aboard Quint's boat in the middle of the night, sharing a drink, telling stories, comparing their scars. And Chief Brody asked Captain Quint about a particular scar on his arm, and he says, that's a tattoo. And then asks him what the tattoo is of, and he says it's of the Indianapolis. And he tells the story, which I'll talk about in a moment. But to get to the Indianapolis, let's understand what was going on in the world at that time. In July of 1945, World War II was in its final stages. The European theater had closed. Germany had surrendered in May of 1945. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide at the end of April. That war was over, but the Pacific theater raged on. And the Japanese, despite long odds and what appeared to the rest of the world to be an obvious defeat, that they could not win that war, would not surrender. And American forces continued to push the Japanese back towards their home island. We were waging a campaign that we referred to as island hopping, where we fought the Japanese island to island throughout the Pacific, defeating them one after another in what was brutal fighting. And the Japanese were brutal when they took American prisoners of war in their treatment of them. It was an ugly and awful war. But by July of 1945, pretty much all that remained was an invasion of the homeland, the Japanese main island. And that was going to be a horrendous struggle. The Japanese would fight to the death of every living man, woman, and child to not have to surrender their home island. And American forces or American leaders believed that an invasion of the Japanese homeland could cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000, maybe even upwards of 500,000 casualties, depending on the nature of that fighting. But we had been working on for several years a very secret project in the United States. And that was known as the Manhattan Project, and it was the project to build the atomic bomb. And in July of 1945, we tested it for the first time out at a site in the New Mexico desert known as Trinity. And the success of that test encouraged President Harry Truman, who'd only been president for a couple of months. Franklin Roosevelt had died in April of that year. Harry Truman became president and was only told of the existence of the atomic bomb just weeks before we actually tested it. He didn't even know. Truman had not been Roosevelt's vice president, so he wasn't brought into the fold on the existence of this thing until weeks before we tested it. And once it was tested successfully, he had to make a choice. He understood that the use of the atomic bomb would be to unleash the greatest weapon ever known in the history of mankind, and that it would probably spur other nations, particularly the Soviet Union, to acquire their own, and it may launch a nuclear arms race or even a full-scale nuclear war. But in the moment, the thought of an invasion of the Japanese homeland was unacceptable, given the fact that it could cost the lives of somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 Americans potentially. And so Truman, in order to spare that from happening, and also to deter the Soviet Union from getting involved in the Asian theater, chose to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. To the Indianapolis. July 16th, 1945. Those atomic bombs, the components to make those atomic bombs, were loaded aboard the Indianapolis, American battleship, cruiser, I believe, leaving out of the port of San Francisco. Set sail for the small island of Tinian Island, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, from which those bombs would eventually be loaded aboard an airplane known as the Enola Gay, flown over Japan and dropped. Returning from that mission, the Indianapolis was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and went down in the middle of the Pacific. 1,100 sailors on board. They all went into the water, those who weren't killed immediately by the blast. So approximately 1,000 sailors went into the water. The mission was so secret that the Navy did not have details on the coordinates of the Indianapolis. And they didn't even find out about the sinking until 3 full days later. Those sailors had been in the water for 3 full days before the Navy even learned that the Indianapolis was down. It was only after the Indianapolis did not report back to port in San Francisco on time that they realized there was an issue. And then a massive search party was sent out, but they had to scan a massive area, about a 2,000-mile area of the Pacific Ocean, due to how far the ship could have drifted, or when it went down, how far sailors could have drifted. And it took them another almost 2 days to locate the remaining sailors. When they found those sailors in the Pacific Ocean, only 300 some remained. 1,000 or so went into the water, 300 or some remained. What happened to the rest of them? Well, dehydration, death by dehydration, death by exposure to the sun, death by drinking salt water because you were dehydrated, which would cause hallucinations. Sailors would see mirages in the distance. There's a ship in the distance, and they would swim off to their death. But many of them, again, referencing Jaws, the famous story told by Captain Quint, many of them were eaten by sharks. The horror of the stories that some of these sailors told in the aftermath about being grouped together with a bunch of sailors, clinging to cargo nets or clinging to debris floating in the water, and the sharks coming in and just feeding, the frenzy that the sharks would be able to just feed at will, watching people being eaten alive by sharks, trying to figure out if you'd be next. Terrifying ordeal. But for the survivors, they also talked about these incredible stories of unity, of helping one another through the ordeal, of encouraging one another to stay in the fight, so to speak, telling stories about their families, telling stories about what they wanted to do when they got back to America, what they would do with the rest of their lives. Literally fighting off sharks with pieces of wood or metal or whatever they could grab that was floating in the water. It is a harrowing ordeal. It is mind-boggling. It is something I can't possibly wrap my brain around. I've never been to war. I don't ever want to go to war. I have no desire to experience that. And I'm grateful to the soldiers who have served, who have put their lives on the line, who have gone through these horrendous ordeals, and those who I have talked to who have served in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam tell stories that make no sense to me. The conditions under which you operate, under which you exist in warfare, are not the conditions by any stretch of the imagination that exist on a day-to-day. The problems of everyday life pale in comparison to the problems that you face when you are in combat. It's mind-boggling. And I think back to the Indianapolis, and then I look at the way we talk about courage in sports, and I don't want to conflate the two. There are incredibly courageous athletes. As a football coach, as a former football player, there are a lot of people who have said things like, boy, it takes a lot of courage to be a football player. And it does. It's a physical game. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for everyone. When you coach that sport, the day that you really learn about kids is the day the pads go on. Because that's when it gets real. And that's when they have to step up and decide if they're about that. But to conflate that with the military is absurd. You know, I think about some of the most courageous athletes, whether it's football or other sports. And again, there are phenomenal stories. There are individuals who have overcome tremendous physical limitations or disabilities. I think about guys like Rocky Blyer, former Pittsburgh Steelers running back who had part of his foot blown off in combat in Vietnam. He had been drafted by the Steelers out of Notre Dame, but he was then drafted by the U.S. military, sent to serve in Vietnam, has part of his foot blown off, has to come back, and the Steelers, to the credit of owner Art Rooney, kept a spot for him on the team, and it took him several years to rehab himself to be able to get in position to even try to make it in the NFL. And he went on to be an integral part of 4 Super Bowl winning teams for the Steelers. I think of Jim Abbott, the baseball pitcher, born without a right arm, a right hand, who taught himself to pitch left-handed and somehow managed the unbelievably ridiculous act of balancing his glove on his right hand, or what remained of a right hand, as he pitched, and then immediately putting the glove on his left hand so that he could field. And if he actually had to field a ground ball, he would then quickly pull his hand out of his glove and throw the ball to first base. It was a remarkable thing. And this is a guy who was a really good major league pitcher, won over 100 games as a major league pitcher. I think about Bethany Hamilton, the surfer. 13 years old, had part of her arm, basically all of her arm, taken away by a shark attack while surfing. And yet continued to surf and to serve as an inspiration for young girls and young athletes across the world because of her courage, her resilience, her refusal to allow that incident to deter her from her goal of becoming a professional surfer. You have great stories of mental courage. I think about athletes like Kevin Love, the basketball player, or gymnast Simone Biles, who have openly struggled with mental health issues and have been very, very public about their mental health and the need for them to step away from their sport, to treat themselves so that they can be healthy both on and off the fields of competition. Or tennis player Monica Seles, who was stabbed by a crazy fan at the 1993 French Open. Fan came out of the stands and stabbed her while she was sitting on a bench during a break in her match. And Monica Seles, traumatized, understandably, by that event, went through tremendous emotional struggle to try to get back on a tennis court, and yet eventually rebounded and won a major at the 1996 Australian Open. Tremendous mental courage. And then you have the courage of those people who are willing to stand up for their principles. Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball. Cassius Clay, in the face of tremendous adversity, converting to Islam, taking the name Muhammad Ali, standing up for his principles and beliefs, refusing to be inducted into the military during the Vietnam War because of his views against that war and speaking out. Not popular by any stretch of the imagination. People still, to this day, hate Ali for that. But he did show the courage of his convictions by standing up for his principles and beliefs. Courage takes many forms among athletes. And these are all legitimate examples of courageous individuals. But today, as we approach the 80th anniversary of the Indianapolis, it's definitely worth remembering the courage shown by those anonymous individuals who have put themselves in the ultimate situations of sacrifice for the good of the country. And for those who have survived it, their stories are worth remembering because they exist on a different plane, on another level from some of the stories told here. So I think it's important to remember the Indianapolis, the stories of some of our veterans who have served this nation in its highest capacity, to be grateful for them, and to remember sports, as courageous as many of those individuals are, still a game. It's a choice. War's different. You can walk away from an athletic competition anytime you want. War doesn't work that way. So, on the 80th anniversary of the Indianapolis, tremendous story worth remembering. And if you want more, man, there's a lot of information about it. Go out there, read about it. It's a fascinating story. All right, that is our Tuesday show. Tomorrow, Whiteboard Wednesday. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, my guest, Dennis Scuderi, longtime coach here in Southern New Jersey, son of a coach, former head coach at Absegami High School, current offensive coordinator at one of the great football programs here in Southern New Jersey, Shawnee High School. And we're going to get into spread offense principles and philosophy and try to both define it and also hash out some of the misconceptions about what is the spread. So that'll be a great show. And then Thursday, my show will be from the road. I'll be out in Latrobe, Pennsylvania for Pittsburgh Steelers training camp, and we'll do a training camp show then. So don't want to miss that one. All right. Until then, hope everybody has a great day. Take care, everybody.